The sun was blazing down on the infinity pool deck when Jessica Martinez looked me up and down with disgust and said, "Honestly, someone like you should really cover up at a place like this." She had no idea she was standing on my property, insulting me at the resort I had built from nothing. What happened next changed everything for her weekend getaway and taught an entire crowd of entitled guests a lesson they'll never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Collins, and at 34, I've learned that success often comes with the unexpected price of invisibility. Most people see what they expect to see, and when you're a woman who built a multi-million-dollar resort empire while preferring flip-flops to designer heels, you become remarkably good at blending into crowds. That Saturday afternoon in July, as I lounged by the pool at my own Sunset Palms Resort and Spa in Clearwater Bay, Florida, I was just another guest, enjoying the perfect 85-degree weather. Or so everyone thought. The annual influencer weekend was in full swing, transforming my usually serene property into a carnival of ring lights, posed photos, and manufactured moments designed for social media consumption. I had mixed feelings about these events. They brought significant revenue and elevated our profile among younger demographics. But they also attracted a particular type of guest who measured worth in followers and branded everything from their morning coffee to their bathroom breaks. Still, business was business, and Emma Davis, my best friend and business partner, had convinced me these partnerships were essential for staying competitive in the hospitality market. I had arrived that morning dressed casually in a simple black one-piece swimsuit, denim shorts, and my favorite oversized sun hat. My goal was simple: observe the event firsthand, ensure everything ran smoothly, and perhaps catch up with Mike Rodriguez, my general manager, about some upcoming property improvements. What I didn't anticipate was becoming the target of a group of guests who apparently felt entitled to police other people's bodies and presence at what they assumed was their exclusive playground. The trouble started near the VIP cabana section, where influencers and their entourages had claimed prime real estate overlooking the ocean. I had been swimming laps in the main pool, something I did regularly to clear my head and stay connected to the guest experience. After finishing my workout, I was toweling off near the pool's edge when I noticed a commotion at one of the nearby loungers. A woman with perfectly contoured features and an orange bikini that cost more than most people's monthly rent was directing her phone camera at various angles, clearly frustrated with the lighting or background. Jessica Martinez had over 2 million followers on social media, according to the guest list I had reviewed earlier that week. She was exactly the type of micro-celebrity our marketing team courted. Young, attractive, with an audience that hung on her every recommendation about fashion, travel, and lifestyle products. Her boyfriend, Brad Thompson, hovered nearby holding what appeared to be professional photography equipment, occasionally offering suggestions that she dismissed with practiced irritation. They were surrounded by a small group of other guests, who seemed eager to be included in whatever content was being created. As I walked past their setup toward my preferred lounger in a quieter section, I heard Jessica's voice rise above the ambient pool noise. "Excuse me, could you move? You're totally ruining the aesthetic of my shot." She was addressing me with the casual entitlement of someone accustomed to having her requests treated as commands. I looked around, realizing I was standing near the infinity pool's edge, where the water seemed to blend seamlessly with the ocean horizon. It was indeed a stunning backdrop, one of the design elements I was most proud of from our major renovation 3 years ago. "Of course," I replied pleasantly, stepping aside. "Sorry about that." I had learned long ago that sometimes the path of least resistance was the wisest choice, particularly when dealing with guests who might later express their dissatisfaction in public reviews or social media posts. Customer service had always been my priority, even when customers were unreasonable. But Jessica wasn't finished. As I moved away, I heard her speaking to her companions, in a voice clearly intended for me to overhear. I mean, honestly, some people just don't understand appropriate pool attire for a high-end resort. There should really be dress codes for these kinds of places. Her words were punctuated by the artificial laugh of someone performing for an audience, both digital and physical. Brad joined in with his own commentary. Totally, babe. This is supposed to be an exclusive event. They should screen people better. His tone carried the assumption that I was somehow an interloper, someone who didn't belong in their carefully curated environment. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I continued toward my destination, hoping the moment would pass without further escalation. Unfortunately, Karen Williams, another guest I recognized from the check-in roster, decided to contribute her own observations. I was thinking the same thing. I mean, we're paying premium prices for this experience. There should be standards about who can use the pool areas during private events. She spoke as if I had suddenly become invisible, as if my presence had been reduced to an abstract problem to be solved rather than a person to be treated with basic respect. I settled onto my lounger, pulled out the novel I had been reading, and tried to focus on the story rather than the conversation continuing nearby. This wasn't the first time I had encountered entitled behavior from guests, though it was unusual for it to be directed at me personally. Most of the time, complaints about other guests were delivered to the front desk or management, not performed as public theater designed to humiliate someone within earshot. The comments continued sporadically over the next hour, growing bolder as the group apparently decided I was either deaf or sufficiently intimidated to ignore them. Jessica made several more references to inappropriate swimwear and the need for better screening procedures. Brad contributed observations about how certain types of people didn't understand luxury hospitality etiquette. Karen added her own suggestions about implementing membership requirements or, quote, guest approval processes to maintain the resort's exclusive atmosphere. What struck me most about their behavior wasn't just the cruelty, but the assumption underlying it. They had looked at me, a woman in a simple black. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Swimsuit, reading a book, bothering no one, and decided that I represented some kind of threat to their experience. They had created an entire narrative about my unworthiness, based solely on their perception that I didn't fit their image of who belonged in their space. The fact that this was actually my space, that I had designed every element of the pool area they were enjoying, that their very presence depended on my business decisions, never occurred to them. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself studying the group dynamics with growing fascination. Jessica was clearly the ringleader, but her authority seemed to depend on constant validation from her followers and immediate companions. Brad played the role of supportive boyfriend, but his comments revealed a deep insecurity masked by aggression. Karen appeared to be seeking acceptance from the younger, more glamorous pair by proving her willingness to participate in their casual cruelty. It was a perfect microcosm of how hierarchies form and how people establish their place by pushing others down. Around 3 o'clock, the situation escalated beyond passive-aggressive commentary. I had been reading peacefully, occasionally glancing up to watch the ocean or observe the various activities around the pool area. The influencer group had moved their photo session closer to my location, apparently drawn by the same scenic backdrop that had attracted me to this particular spot. Their equipment setup had expanded to include multiple cameras, reflectors, and what appeared to be a small drone for aerial shots. Jessica was posing near the pool's edge, directing Brad and another assistant to capture her from various angles when she noticed me in the background of several shots. Rather than simply asking if I could move or waiting for me to relocate naturally, she decided to make her request a public performance. "Excuse me," she called out loudly enough for everyone in the immediate area to hear. "Could you please cover up or move somewhere else? This is supposed to be an exclusive shoot, and you're really not fitting the vibe we're going for." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Conversations at nearby tables quieted as people turned to observe the confrontation. I felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rise in my cheeks, not because I had done anything wrong, but because someone had chosen to humiliate me in front of dozens of witnesses. For a moment, I considered simply gathering my things and leaving, taking the path of least resistance as I had earlier. But something about Jessica's tone, the casual cruelty of her public dismissal, made me pause. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice level and polite. "I'm not sure what you mean by cover-up. I'm wearing a perfectly appropriate swimsuit for a pool area." I gestured to my simple black one-piece, which was considerably more conservative than most of the bikinis worn by other guests, including Jessica herself. Brad stepped forward, apparently feeling the need to support his girlfriend's position. Look, lady, this is a private event for influencers and VIP guests. Maybe you didn't get the memo, but there are certain expectations for this kind of gathering. You might be more comfortable at the public beach down the road. His words carried the clear implication that I was somehow trespassing, that my presence was a mistake that needed to be corrected. Karen nodded enthusiastically, emboldened by having two allies in her corner. Exactly! I mean, we're all here because we understand luxury hospitality and how to conduct ourselves appropriately. Some people just don't have that awareness. She looked directly at me while speaking, making her target unmistakable. The small crowd that had gathered to watch this public dressing down was growing larger. I could see other guests pulling out their phones, whether to record potential drama or simply to document another moment of their curated vacation experience. Several resort staff members had also noticed the commotion, including Lisa Chen, one of our pool attendants, who looked uncertain about whether to intervene. I caught her eye and gave a small shake of my head, signaling that I could handle the situation myself. What happened next was the moment that would transform this unpleasant encounter into something far more significant. Mike Rodriguez, my general manager and one of the few people who knew I preferred to observe our operations anonymously, had been conducting his usual afternoon rounds when he noticed the gathering crowd. Mike had worked with me for 6 years, ever since I had promoted him from assistant manager at our first property. He was professional, discreet, and absolutely loyal to both me and the resort's reputation. As Mike approached the group, I saw him quickly assess the situation. His expression remained neutral, but I knew him well enough to recognize the subtle tension in his posture that indicated displeasure. He had undoubtedly heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening, and I could practically see him calculating the best way to diffuse the situation without causing further embarrassment to anyone involved. "Good afternoon, everyone," Mike said pleasantly, addressing the group with the practiced charm that made him excellent at his job. "I'm Mike Rodriguez, the general manager here at Sunset Palms. I couldn't help but notice some kind of misunderstanding. Is there anything I can help clarify or resolve?" His tone was perfectly professional, giving everyone involved an opportunity to step back from the confrontation gracefully. Jessica, apparently interpreting Mike's arrival as validation of her position, smiled triumphantly. "Actually, yes. We're trying to conduct a professional photo shoot for a major brand partnership, and this woman is interfering with our work. We've explained that this is a private VIP event, but she doesn't seem to understand that she needs to either cover up appropriately or find somewhere else to spend her afternoon." She gestured toward me dismissively, as if I were an inanimate obstacle rather than a person deserving of basic courtesy. Mike's expression didn't change, but I noticed his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I see. And may I ask what specifically about this guest's attire or behavior is inappropriate for our pool area?" His question was posed politely, but with an undertone that suggested he was genuinely curious about the answer. Brad stepped forward, apparently feeling confident in his position. "Look, man, we're paying serious money for this experience. We expect a certain level of exclusivity and atmosphere. When random people can just wander in wearing whatever they want, it kind of defeats the purpose of booking a luxury resort." He looked around at their companions for support, receiving nods and murmurs of agreement. "I understand your desire for an exceptional experience," Mike replied smoothly. "That's exactly what we strive to provide for all our guests. However, I want to make sure I understand your concern correctly. This guest is wearing a swimsuit in our pool area, which seems appropriate for the location. She appears to be reading quietly and hasn't interfered with your activities. Could you help me understand what specific resort policy or standard she's violating?" The question hung in the air, and I watched as Jessica's confidence began to waver slightly. She had been operating under the assumption that her status as an influencer and paying guest gave her the authority to determine who belonged in shared spaces. Mike's professional questioning was forcing her to articulate a position that sounded increasingly unreasonable when stated directly. "It's not about policies. Karen interjected, apparently sensing that Jessica needed support. It's about maintaining the right atmosphere for the type of clientele this resort attracts. Some people just don't understand how to conduct themselves in upscale environments. Her words were carefully chosen to avoid explicitly stating her objections, while still conveying her meaning. Mike nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this perspective seriously. I appreciate you sharing your concerns about our atmosphere and clientele standards. Those are indeed important considerations for any luxury hospitality operation. As it happens, I think there might be someone you should meet who could address your concerns more comprehensively than I can. He paused, glancing in my direction with an expression that I recognized as barely contained amusement. Would you mind waiting here for just a moment while I arrange that introduction? The group exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about what Mike had in mind, but apparently assuming that he was going to summon some higher authority who would validate their position and resolve the situation in their favor. Jessica nodded regally, as if granting permission for Mike to proceed with whatever administrative process she assumed was necessary. Of course, she said. We'd be happy to explain our concerns to whoever makes these kinds of decisions. I think once management understands the situation, they'll see why it's important to maintain certain standards. Her tone suggested complete confidence that any reasonable authority figure would side with paying VIP guests over a random woman in a basic swimsuit. Mike smiled, and I caught the hint of mischief in his expression that I had seen many times over the years when he was about to deliver unexpected news. Actually, you've already met the person who makes these decisions. You've been talking to her for the past several minutes. He gestured toward me with the respectful deference he always showed, despite our long friendship and working relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Sarah Collins, the founder and owner of Sunset Palms Resort. The silence that followed Mike's introduction was so complete that I could hear the gentle lapping of waves against the infinity pool's edge and the distant cry of seagulls overhead. The expressions on Jessica's, Brad's, and Karen's faces shifted through a remarkable range of emotions in the span of a few seconds. Confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally, the dawning realization of exactly how badly they had miscalculated the situation. I stood up slowly, setting my book aside and extending my hand toward Jessica with the same professional courtesy I showed to every guest, regardless of how they had treated me. Jessica, it's a pleasure to finally meet you properly. I've been looking forward to seeing how your weekend at our resort has been going. My voice was calm and pleasant, betraying none of the anger or hurt I had felt during their earlier comments. Jessica stared at my outstretched hand as if it were a poisonous snake, her face cycling through shades of red that rivaled her carefully applied bronzer. Brad had gone completely pale, his earlier bravado evaporating as he realized that his dismissive comments about certain types of people had been directed at the person who controlled every aspect of their weekend experience. Karen, meanwhile, appeared to be calculating whether there was any way to pretend the last hour hadn't happened, her eyes darting between me and the growing crowd of onlookers who had witnessed the entire exchange. The phones that had been recording their anticipated triumph were now documenting their humiliation, creating a permanent record of their behavior that would likely spread far beyond the resort's boundaries. The broader implications of the situation were clearly beginning to dawn on the group. This wasn't just an embarrassing social mistake, it was a professional disaster. Jessica's brand depended on maintaining relationships with luxury hospitality providers. Brad's photography business relied on access to high-end venues for client shoots. Karen's social media presence was built around showcasing exclusive experiences and locations. They had just burned bridges with someone who could influence their access to similar opportunities throughout the industry. Mike, ever the professional, stepped forward to fill the uncomfortable silence. Sarah, these guests were expressing some concerns about our pool area policies and clientele standards. I thought you might want to address their feedback directly. His tone remained perfectly neutral, but I could see the satisfaction in his eyes as he watched the group struggle with their new reality. I nodded appreciatively toward Mike, then turned back to the group with the same warm smile I used to welcome new guests during check-in. I'm always interested in feedback from our visitors. Please, tell me more about your concerns regarding appropriate attire and guest screening procedures. As the owner, I want to ensure we're maintaining the standards our guests expect. My invitation was genuine, though I suspected they would find it difficult to repeat their earlier criticisms while looking directly at their target. The next few minutes passed in excruciating awkwardness, as Jessica, Brad, and Karen struggled to find words that might somehow salvage the situation. Their earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate realization that they had publicly humiliated themselves in front of dozens of witnesses, many of whom were now recording their discomfort for posterity. Jessica finally managed to speak, her voice much quieter than it had been during her earlier pronouncements. There must have been some misunderstanding. We didn't realize. She trailed off, apparently unable to complete a sentence that might explain how failing to recognize me justified their behavior toward any guest. I think I understand, I said gently, though my words carried an edge that made clear I understood far more than they might be comfortable with. You made assumptions about who I was based on my appearance, and decided that gave you the right to publicly humiliate me and suggest I didn't belong in a space that I actually own. Is that an accurate summary of the misunderstanding? The question forced them to confront the reality of their actions without any comfortable euphemisms or face-saving explanations. They had behaved badly, not because they didn't know who I was, but because they thought they knew exactly who I was, and believed that gave them license to treat me poorly. My identity as the resort owner only made their behavior more consequential, not more fundamentally wrong. Brad attempted to salvage something from the situation. Look, we obviously didn't know who you were. If we had known, we never would have. We were just trying to maintain the atmosphere that we thought the resort wanted. His explanation only served to highlight that his courtesy was conditional on status, rather than basic human decency. I appreciate your honesty, I replied. It's helpful to know that you believe certain guests deserve different treatment based on your perception of their importance or status. That's valuable feedback about how some visitors view our community standards. The phrase community standards was chosen deliberately, emphasizing that respectful behavior should be universal rather than dependent on hierarchy. As our conversation continued, I noticed Tom Anderson, our head of security, approaching from the direction of the main building. His presence wasn't threatening, but it served as a reminder that this was still a business establishment with policies and procedures that applied to everyone. Mike had undoubtedly contacted him as a precautionary measure, ensuring that someone with authority was available if the situation required intervention. The crowd around our impromptu gathering had grown larger, with guests openly filming and photographing the encounter. Social media posts were undoubtedly already circulating, though I suspected the narrative would be quite different from what Jessica had originally planned to share with her followers. Instead of documenting her exclusive VIP experience, she was now the star of a cautionary tale about entitlement and the importance of treating everyone with respect. Emma Davis, my business partner and longtime friend, appeared at the edge of the crowd, having heard about the commotion from staff members. She caught my eye and raised an eyebrow in a silent question about whether I needed support. I gave her a subtle shake of my head, indicating that I had the situation under control, but her presence reminded me that I wasn't facing this alone. The team we had built together over 8 years was solid, professional, and absolutely committed to treating every guest with dignity regardless of their status or background. The conversation was reaching a natural conclusion, though the implications would likely extend far beyond this single afternoon. Jessica, Brad, and Karen had revealed something about their character that couldn't be taken back, and their behavior had been witnessed and recorded by dozens of people. The story would spread through social media networks, hospitality industry circles, and word-of-mouth channels, creating consequences that would follow them long after they checked out of Sunset Palms. I looked around at the faces in the crowd, seeing a mixture of emotions: embarrassment for the group who had behaved so poorly, admiration for the way the situation had been handled, and perhaps most importantly, a renewed understanding of why treating everyone with respect matters. The lesson wasn't just for Jessica, Brad, and Karen. It was for everyone who witnessed how quickly arrogance and entitlement can transform triumph into humiliation. The afternoon sun was beginning to lower toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the pool deck and reminding everyone that this perfect beach day would eventually end. But the memory of this encounter and the lessons it contained about assumption, respect, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity would last much longer than any vacation. The weight of the moment settled over the pool deck like a heavy blanket. Jessica's face had transformed from smug satisfaction to something resembling panic as she processed what Mike had just revealed. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled slightly as she lowered her phone, which had been poised to capture what she thought would be her triumphant moment of putting an entitled interloper in her place. Instead, she found herself face to face with the woman who controlled not just this pool deck, but the entire resort experience she had been so eager to flaunt to her millions of followers. Brad's transformation was equally dramatic. The cocky confidence that had fueled his dismissive comments about certain types of people evaporated completely, leaving behind a pale, sweating man who was clearly calculating the potential damage to his photography business. His equipment, which had been arranged so carefully to capture Jessica's content, now felt like evidence of his participation in what was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. The realization that he had just insulted the owner of one of Florida's most prestigious resorts was written across his face in expressions of mounting horror. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to be hoping that if she remained perfectly still, she might somehow become invisible. Her earlier enthusiasm for excluding people who didn't meet her standards had vanished, replaced by the dawning understanding that she had just revealed herself to be exactly the type of guest that luxury establishments typically preferred to avoid. Her comments about membership requirements and guest approval processes now hung in the air like accusations against her own character. I allowed the silence to stretch for several more seconds, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted them to fully absorb the lesson that was unfolding. This wasn't just about embarrassing 3 people who had behaved badly. It was about demonstrating to everyone present that assumptions about worth and belonging can be dangerous, and that treating people with respect should never be conditional on their perceived status or importance. The crowd around us had grown to include nearly 50 people, a mix of other influencer weekend participants, regular resort guests, and staff members who had been drawn by the commotion. Many were holding phones, capturing every moment of what was clearly going to become a viral sensation. I could already imagine the headlines and social media captions that would emerge from this encounter, and I found myself hoping that the real lesson wouldn't be lost in the entertainment value of watching entitled people get their comeuppance. Tom Anderson had positioned himself discreetly at the edge of the gathering, his presence serving as a subtle reminder that this was still a business establishment with standards and policies. His expression remained neutral, but I knew him well enough to recognize the slight tension in his posture that indicated readiness to intervene if necessary. After 8 years of working together, Tom had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate when situations might escalate beyond verbal exchanges. Emma had also moved closer, though she maintained the careful distance that our professional relationship required in public settings. As my business partner, she understood the delicate balance between personal friendship and corporate responsibility that governed our interactions during business hours. Her presence was reassuring, a reminder that whatever happened next, I wasn't facing this situation alone. Mike remained positioned between me and the group, his role as general manager requiring him to facilitate whatever resolution would emerge from this encounter. His earlier amusement at the group's discomfort had faded into professional concern as he recognized the broader implications of the situation. A confrontation like this, captured on dozens of phones and likely to spread across social media platforms, could impact the resort's reputation in ways that extended far beyond this single weekend. I took a deep breath and made a decision that would shape not only the remainder of this encounter, but potentially the way our resort approached similar situations in the future. Rather than prolonging the group's embarrassment or using my position to exact some form of revenge, I chose to treat this as an opportunity for education and growth. I think we have an opportunity here, I said, addressing not just Jessica, Brad, and Karen, but the entire crowd that had gathered to witness this drama. What happened today illustrates something important about assumptions and how we treat each other in shared spaces. I'd like to use this moment to have a conversation about respect, community, and what it really means to create an inclusive environment. Jessica looked up at me with an expression that mixed relief with continued apprehension. She clearly hadn't expected this response, and I could see her trying to calculate whether my words represented genuine forgiveness or a more sophisticated form of punishment. Her social media training had prepared her for many scenarios, but being publicly corrected by a resort owner while surrounded by recording phones wasn't covered in any influencer handbook. The truth is, I continued. What happened here today isn't really about me being the resort owner. If I had been any other guest, the behavior you displayed would have been equally inappropriate and hurtful. The fact that I happen to own this property makes the situation more ironic, but it doesn't make your actions more fundamentally wrong. They were wrong, regardless of who I am. This distinction was important to me because I wanted the lesson to extend beyond the simple morality tale of, don't be rude because you never know who you're talking to. The real message needed to be that treating people poorly is wrong in itself, not because of the potential consequences if your target turns out to be someone important. Brad seemed to understand this point immediately, his face flushing with what appeared to be genuine shame rather than just embarrassment at being caught. You're absolutely right, he said, his voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the pool area. We were completely out of line, and it wouldn't have been okay regardless of who you were. I'm genuinely sorry for my behavior. His apology felt authentic, and I appreciated that he had grasped the deeper lesson rather than just responding to the immediate social pressure of the situation. Karen nodded vigorously in agreement, though her expression suggested she was still processing the full implications of what had occurred. Jessica, however, seemed to be struggling with something more complex than simple embarrassment. As someone whose livelihood depended on projecting confidence and authority to her followers, admitting fundamental misjudgment represented more than just personal humiliation. It potentially threatened her entire professional identity. The carefully constructed persona that had attracted millions of followers was built on the assumption that she possessed superior judgment about fashion, lifestyle, and social dynamics. I need to think about this, she said finally, her voice small and uncertain. I need to really think about what just happened and why I thought it was okay to treat you that way. Her words carried the weight of someone confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves, and I found myself hoping that this experience might genuinely lead to positive change rather than just temporary embarrassment. Mike stepped forward, his general manager instincts recognizing that the situation needed some kind of formal resolution. Sarah, would you like me to arrange a private space where you can continue this conversation? His offer was diplomatic, providing an opportunity for everyone to save face, while removing the public spectacle element that was clearly adding pressure to an already difficult situation. I considered his suggestion carefully. On one hand, moving the conversation to a private setting would allow for more honest dialogue without the performance pressure created by dozens of recording phones. On the other hand, the public nature of the original offense meant that the resolution needed to be equally visible to serve as a proper lesson for other guests who might be tempted to engage in similar behavior. I think we should continue here, I decided. The original comments were made publicly, so the conversation about why they were problematic should also be public. But I want to be clear that this isn't about punishment or humiliation. It's about learning and growth. The crowd seemed to sense that something significant was happening beyond simple drama or entertainment. Conversations among onlookers had shifted from excited gossip to more thoughtful discussions about respect, assumptions, and social dynamics. I could hear fragments of these conversations, and I was encouraged by the apparent recognition that this situation offered lessons for everyone present. Lisa Chen, our pool attendant, had been watching from a distance, and I could see the pride in her expression as she observed how the situation was being handled. As a staff member who regularly dealt with difficult guests, she understood better than most how challenging it could be to maintain professionalism while addressing inappropriate behavior. The fact that this confrontation was being resolved through dialogue, rather than punishment or banishment, represented the kind of leadership she had come to expect from our management team. Emma caught my eye and nodded approvingly, recognizing that I was choosing the harder but more constructive path of education over the easier option of simply exercising my authority to remove problematic guests. This approach aligned with the values we had established when we first opened Sunset Palms, values that emphasized community building and personal growth alongside luxury hospitality. I want to share something with all of you, I said, raising my voice slightly to address the entire crowd. When we designed this resort, Emma and I made a conscious decision to create a space that felt welcoming to everyone, regardless of their background, appearance, or social media following. We wanted people to feel comfortable being themselves, rather than feeling pressure to conform to someone else's expectations. This philosophy hadn't been accidental or casual. It had emerged from our own experiences in hospitality settings, where we had felt judged or excluded based on superficial characteristics. Both Emma and I had worked in environments where staff and guests were treated differently based on perceived status, and we had seen how that kind of hierarchy damaged both individual well-being and overall community dynamics. The challenge, I continued, is that creating truly inclusive spaces requires everyone to participate. It's not enough for management to establish policies if guests feel entitled to police each other's presence or appearance. Community standards have to be maintained by the entire community, not just imposed from above. Jessica looked up at me with an expression that suggested she was beginning to understand the broader implications of what had occurred. So you're saying that when we made those comments about you, we weren't just being rude to one person. We were undermining the entire atmosphere you're trying to create here? Her question demonstrated a level of insight that I hadn't expected, and I felt a surge of hope that this encounter might genuinely lead to positive change rather than just temporary embarrassment. Exactly. When guests feel empowered to exclude or criticize others based on their own prejudices, it creates an environment where everyone has to worry about whether they measure up to someone else's arbitrary standards. Brad nodded thoughtfully, his earlier defensiveness replaced by what appeared to be genuine reflection. And it creates a hierarchy where people are constantly trying to establish their own status by putting others down, instead of just enjoying the experience. That's a very astute observation, I acknowledged. Luxury hospitality should enhance people's lives, not create additional stress about social positioning or appearance management. The goal is for everyone to feel relaxed and valued, not constantly evaluated. Karen, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke up. I think I understand now why you're not just kicking us out. You're trying to make sure this doesn't happen to other guests. Her tone carried a note of surprise, as if she hadn't expected to encounter educational leadership rather than punitive authority. Removing you from the property would be easier, I admitted, but it wouldn't address the underlying attitudes that led to this situation. And frankly, it wouldn't help you grow as people or as guests in other hospitality settings. The point isn't to punish you. It's to help everyone learn from what happened. The conversation was beginning to attract attention from guests who hadn't witnessed the original confrontation. New arrivals to the pool area were clearly curious about the large gathering and the serious tone of the discussion, and I could see Mike discreetly briefing staff members who approached with questions about whether intervention was necessary. Tom Anderson had relaxed his posture slightly, recognizing that the situation was resolving constructively rather than escalating toward conflict. His experience with resort security had taught him to recognize the difference between drama that needed to be contained and genuine dialogue that deserved space to unfold naturally. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the pool deck, and I realized that this encounter had consumed nearly 2 hours of what should have been a relaxing Saturday afternoon. Yet I found myself feeling energized rather than drained by the experience. There was something deeply satisfying about addressing a difficult situation through conversation and education, rather than simply exercising authority to make it disappear. I have a proposal, I said, looking directly at Jessica, Brad, and Karen. I'd like to invite you to stay for the remainder of your weekend, not as punishment, but as an opportunity to experience what our community can be like when everyone feels welcome and respected. Consider it a chance to practice the kind of inclusive behavior that makes spaces like this work for everyone. The offer surprised them, and I could see them processing the implications. Jessica's first instinct seemed to be relief that she wasn't being ejected from the resort, but I could also see her wrestling with the prospect of spending the rest of her weekend under the scrutiny of guests who had witnessed her behavior. The social media content she had planned to create would now be complicated by the knowledge that her followers might learn about this encounter. That's very generous, Brad said slowly, but I'm not sure I understand what you mean by practice inclusive behavior. What would that look like practically? His question was fair and demonstrated that he was thinking seriously about how to translate this conversation into actual behavioral change. It means engaging with other guests as equals, rather than evaluating them based on your assumptions about their status or worthiness. It means recognizing that everyone here has the same right to enjoy the space and experience, regardless of whether they fit your personal aesthetic preferences. Emma stepped forward slightly, adding her perspective as someone who had observed the entire encounter. It also means being willing to acknowledge when you've made mistakes, rather than trying to justify or minimize behavior that made others uncomfortable. Growth requires honest self-reflection, not just public apologies. Her comment was pointed but not harsh, and I could see it landing with particular impact on Jessica, who was clearly still processing the disconnect between her self-image as a lifestyle authority and the reality of how she had behaved when she thought no one important was watching. The crowd around us was beginning to thin slightly as some guests returned to their afternoon activities, but a core group remained, apparently finding the conversation more engaging than their planned poolside relaxation. Several people had put away their phones, transitioning from passive documentation to active listening, which I interpreted as a positive sign that the educational aspect of the encounter was resonating. Mike approached me discreetly, checking whether I needed any support or whether there were operational considerations that required attention. "The afternoon shift change is coming up," he mentioned quietly. "Should I brief the new staff about the situation? Or do you think we're past the point where special attention is needed?" His question reminded me that this encounter was taking place within the broader context of resort operations, and that dozens of staff members were continuing to serve hundreds of guests while this drama played out in one corner of the property. The fact that the situation had remained contained and constructive was a testament to the professionalism of our team and the maturity of most of our guests. "I think we can treat this as resolved," I told him, "but it might be worth sharing with the team as an example of how to handle difficult situations through dialogue rather than escalation. This could be a valuable training case study." Mike nodded, understanding the broader implications of what had occurred. As someone who had worked in hospitality for over 15 years, he recognized that this encounter represented exactly the kind of situation that could either strengthen or damage a resort's culture, depending on how it was handled. Jessica had been listening to our exchange, and she looked up with an expression that mixed curiosity with continued apprehension. "Can I ask you something? Why did you choose to handle this the way you did? I mean, you could have just had us removed from the property, or made a scene that would have been really damaging to our reputations. Why did you choose education over punishment?" Her question suggested that she was genuinely trying to understand not just what had happened, but why it had unfolded the way it did. This level of reflection was encouraging, and I found myself hoping that the experience might genuinely influence her future behavior rather than just serving as a cautionary tale she would prefer to forget. "Because I believe that people are capable of growth when they're given the opportunity and support to change," I replied. Punishment might have felt satisfying in the moment, but it wouldn't have addressed the underlying attitudes that led to the problem. And it wouldn't have created any positive learning for the other guests who witnessed what happened. The conversation was beginning to reach a natural conclusion, though I suspected that the implications would continue to resonate for everyone involved long after they left the pool deck. The afternoon had transformed from a simple oversight visit into an unexpected masterclass in conflict resolution, community building, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their perceived status. Tom Anderson approached our group, his timing suggesting that he had been monitoring the situation carefully and had determined that formal resolution was appropriate. "Sarah, if you're comfortable with the current situation, I'll return to regular duties. But please let me know if you need any follow-up support." His professional demeanor served as a subtle reminder that while this encounter had resolved positively, the resort maintained clear policies and procedures for addressing guest behavior that crossed acceptable boundaries. The fact that education and dialogue had succeeded in this case didn't mean that all situations would be handled identically. "Thank you, Tom. I think we're in a good place now." I turned back to Jessica, Brad, and Karen, recognizing that some form of closure was needed for everyone involved. "I want to thank you for being willing to engage in this conversation, rather than just walking away. That took courage, and it gives me hope that this experience might lead to positive change." Jessica stood up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate as if she was still processing everything that had occurred. "I need to think about how to handle this with my followers. I mean, people are probably already posting about what happened, and I'm not sure how to address it honestly without completely undermining my brand." Her concern was understandable from a business perspective, though it also revealed the ongoing tension between authentic personal growth and social media persona management. The fact that she was thinking about honest communication rather than damage control suggested that the conversation had genuinely impacted her thinking. Maybe that's part of the learning, I suggested gently. If your brand is built on projecting perfection rather than authenticity, perhaps this is an opportunity to show your followers that growth and accountability are valuable qualities too. The suggestion clearly made her uncomfortable, but I could see her considering it seriously. The influencer economy had created tremendous pressure to maintain flawless public images, but it had also created opportunities for authentic connection with audiences who were hungry for genuine human experiences, rather than manufactured perfection. Brad had begun gathering his photography equipment, his movements suggesting that he was ready to move on from this encounter, but was doing so thoughtfully rather than just trying to escape. I want to apologize again, not just to you, but to anyone who was made uncomfortable by our behavior. That's not who I want to be, either personally or professionally. His words carried weight because they addressed the broader impact of the situation, rather than just the immediate embarrassment of being corrected. Karen nodded in agreement, adding, I think I need to examine some of my own assumptions about what luxury hospitality means and who it's for. The afternoon was beginning to transition toward evening, and the quality of light on the pool deck was shifting from the harsh brightness of midday to the warmer, more forgiving glow of late afternoon. Other guests were beginning to prepare for dinner or evening activities, and I realized that normal resort operations needed to resume their natural rhythm. Emma approached our group, her timing suggesting that she had been monitoring the situation and had determined that my direct involvement was no longer essential. Sarah, the evening events team wanted to check in with you about tonight's welcome reception. Should I let them know you'll be available for the usual host duties? Her question served multiple purposes. It reminded everyone that I had other responsibilities as resort owner, it provided a natural transition away from this encounter, and it demonstrated the ongoing operations that required attention beyond this single situation. Yes, please let them know I'll be there, I replied, then turned back to Jessica, Brad, and Karen. I hope you'll consider joining us for the reception tonight. It might be an opportunity to experience our community from a different perspective. The invitation was genuine, though I recognized that it also represented a test of whether they were genuinely committed to changing their behavior, or were simply relieved to have avoided more serious consequences for their actions. Jessica looked uncertain, clearly weighing the social awkwardness of facing other guests who had witnessed this encounter against the opportunity to demonstrate growth and accountability. I'm not sure how comfortable that would be for everyone involved, she said honestly. Discomfort isn't always a bad thing, I replied. Sometimes it's a sign that we're growing beyond our previous limitations, but the choice is entirely yours. Brad and Karen exchanged glances, apparently having a silent conversation about how to proceed. Finally, Brad spoke for both of them. I think we'd like to try. It feels important to show that we can be better than we were this afternoon. Their willingness to face potential awkwardness rather than hiding in their rooms suggested that the conversation had genuinely impacted their thinking. This was exactly the kind of response I had hoped for when I chose education over punishment. Mike approached our group one final time, his general manager instincts, recognizing that formal closure was needed. Is there anything else that needs to be addressed before we return to regular operations? His question was directed primarily at me, but it also gave Jessica, Brad, and Karen an opportunity to raise any remaining concerns. I think we're good, I said, looking around the group for confirmation. Thank you, Mike, for handling this situation so professionally. And thank you all for being willing to have this conversation, rather than just letting the misunderstanding escalate. As our group began to disperse, I noticed that many of the guests who had witnessed the encounter were lingering nearby, apparently hoping for some kind of final resolution or statement. The social media posts that had undoubtedly been created during the past 2 hours would tell various versions of this story, but I hoped that the overall narrative would emphasize growth and learning rather than just conflict and comeuppance. Lisa Chen approached me as I was gathering my things, her expression reflecting the pride and admiration I had seen from other staff members throughout the afternoon. That was really impressive, she said quietly. I've seen a lot of difficult situations handled poorly, but that was exactly how it should be done. Her comment meant more to me than she probably realized, because it came from someone who regularly dealt with challenging guests and understood the temptation to resolve problems through authority rather than education. The fact that our approach had impressed experienced hospitality professionals suggested that it might serve as a valuable model for future situations. Emma waited until we were walking away from the pool area to share her thoughts on what had occurred. I'm proud of how you handled that, but I'm also curious about whether you think the approach will work with other difficult guests. Not everyone is going to be as responsive to education as they were. Her question was practical and important, because it addressed the broader implications of what had happened. If every guest confrontation required 2 hours of philosophical discussion, our operations would become unsustainable. The approach we had used today needed to be part of a broader framework rather than a standard operating procedure. You're right that not every situation will resolve the same way, I acknowledged. But I think the underlying principles can guide our approach even when the specific tactics need to be different. The goal should always be community building rather than punishment, even when the methods vary. As we reached the main building, I turned back to look at the pool deck where this afternoon's drama had unfolded. The setting sun was casting beautiful shadows across the water, and guests were beginning to gather for evening activities. The normal rhythm of resort life was reasserting itself, but I suspected that the lessons from this encounter would continue to influence our community dynamics long after the immediate participants had checked out. The evening reception would provide an opportunity to observe whether Jessica, Brad, and Karen would follow through on their apparent commitment to changed behavior, or whether the discomfort of facing other guests would lead them to retreat to their rooms. Either choice would be understandable, but their decision would reveal something important about whether this encounter had genuinely influenced their thinking or had simply been an exercise in crisis management. More broadly, the afternoon had reinforced my belief that difficult situations often contain opportunities for positive change if they're approached with the right combination of firmness and compassion. The easy path would have been to simply remove problematic guests and move on, but the harder path of education and dialogue had created learning opportunities that extended far beyond the immediate participants. As I prepared for the evening's events, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected ways that business ownership had evolved beyond simple profit management into community leadership and social education. When Emma and I had first opened Sunset Palms, we had focused primarily on providing excellent hospitality services. We hadn't anticipated that we would also be called upon to model conflict resolution, facilitate difficult conversations, and demonstrate inclusive leadership. Yet these broader responsibilities had become some of the most meaningful aspects of our work, creating opportunities to influence positive change that extended far beyond traditional business metrics. The viral social media posts that would inevitably emerge from this afternoon's encounter would carry lessons about respect, assumptions, and community standards to audiences that would never visit our resort but might benefit from the underlying messages. The reception that evening would tell us whether this optimistic interpretation was justified, or whether the afternoon's apparent breakthroughs would prove to be temporary responses to social pressure, rather than genuine personal growth. Either way, the encounter had demonstrated that choosing education over punishment, even in difficult circumstances, could create opportunities for positive change that benefited everyone involved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.